Hello and welcome back to our second panel, which is looking at the subject of exhibitions and internationalization. My name is Ute Juhlemann-Falck and I am Senior Curator at the Munch Museum and one of the 7 members of the research group Munch Modernism and Modernity. It's a great pleasure to introduce you now to our next 4 speakers. Please make a note of all your questions you may have, and we shall have a joint question and answer session after the 4th talk. And I would like to point out that there's a small mistake in our program. So we will actually break for coffee, not at 3:15, but at 3:30, and then reconvene at 4 o'clock for the last panel. So the first speaker is Gerd Woll, who really is the expert on Edvard Munch and his art. For many decades, she has been working at the Munch Museum, and her many publications on Edvard Munch include the 2 groundbreaking catalogue raisonnés, the complete graphic works of 2001 and complete paintings in 2008 in 4 volumes. Gerd Woll is officially retired, but to all our relief, she is still actively researching and publishing on Munch. The second speaker is Marja Lahelma, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Helsinki. She has published widely on Nordic art and artists, questions of the self and subjectivity, and on the relationship between art, science, and esoteric movements. Recent publications include a biography of the Finnish symbolist artist Hugo Simberg. She's currently working on a biography of Akseli Gallen-Kallela to be published by the Finnish National Gallery in 2018. The third speaker is Oivind Storm-Bjerke, who is professor of 18th and 19th century Northern European history of art at the University of Oslo. He formerly served in numerous museum positions as curator as well as director. His ongoing research focuses on Edvard Munch's posthumous historiography. Last but not least, the final speaker of this session is my colleague LArs Toft-Eriksen, who is curator at the Munch Museum. His curatorial background is modern and contemporary art, and he has curated a number of exhibitions within contemporary art. Most recently, he has curated exhibitions on Asger Jorn, Bjarne Melgaard, as well as Munch. Currently, he is undertaking a PhD at the University of Oslo as a collaboration between the university and the Munch Museum. So Gerd Woll, the floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. I'm so glad that we got a chance to see some good pictures by Munch earlier today, because I'm not going to speak about any particular pictures at all. 3 important exhibitions established Edvard Munch's international reputation. His solo exhibition in Verein Berliner Künstler, Berlin 1892, his participation in Sonderbund in Cologne in 1912, and the large retrospective in Kronprinzenpalais, Berlin 1927. The main question for my presentation is whether Munch's success in Germany may be regarded as a result of a deliberate strategy or mere coincidence. In all these exhibitions, Munch's presence affected some of the ongoing controversies between modern art, which usually meant French art, and the more traditional art favored by the conservative German art world. After having participated regularly in collective exhibitions since 1883, Munch arranged all by himself a solo exhibition in Christiania in 1889. This was a very extraordinary thing to do at the time, but it secured him a state grant which enabled him to go to Paris for further studies. For a short while, he was enrolled at the Bonnat studio, but quickly abandoned the school for studies in museums, galleries, and simply the Parisian life in streets and cafes. He managed to get the grant 3 years in a row, and except for regular visits to Norway during the summer, he stayed in France until 1892. Back in Norway, in September, he arranged a new solo exhibition. This year, for the first time, he did not send any works to the autumn exhibition in Christiania, And from now on, he only participated in collective exhibitions if he was especially invited to do so. He already came to believe that by showing his works together, the meaning would be easier to grasp than when they were presented one by one in between works of many other artists. Letters to Danish friends reveal that he had great hopes for showing the exhibition in Copenhagen as well, but he could hardly have planned for getting it to Berlin. If he wanted to go outside of Scandinavia, I suppose that Paris would have been the obvious choice. Acceptance and, if possible, good recensions or even medals at the Salon in Paris was still the traditional way to obtain international recognition. But in spite of his long stay in France, Munch never sent any works to the ordinary Salon. His only experience with Germany at the time was a participation in a Norwegian section in an international exhibition. In 1891, the Artists' Association in Berlin, Verein Berliner Künstler, celebrated their 50th anniversary by inviting all nations to send works to an international exhibition. For chauvinistic reasons, France chose not to participate, and the 29 Norwegian painters that were first picked out officially withdrew their works when the leader of the exhibition committee, Anton van Werner, dismissed their commissioner in favor of one of his own friends. Van Werner had obviously listened to accusations that the dismissed commissioner was a leader of a group of anarchist impressionists that was suppressing the artistic life in Norway. One of these 29 rebels was Edvard Munch. The Norwegian selection was instead sent to the international exhibition in Munich, where Munch's contribution included these 4 paintings, none of which got any special attention in Munich. With this unhappy first meeting with the Berlin art scene, there was no reason for Munch to believe that his paintings would be particularly welcome in Berlin, where the emperor himself, Wilhelm II, and his good friend von Werner did their best to suppress all modern art, in particular French. But as we know, his solo exhibition did go to Berlin for almost exactly 125 years today. And this is perhaps one of the strangest incidents in the history of modern art. A Norwegian painter, Adolfsen Normann, living in Berlin and a member of the Verein, happened to see Munch's exhibition in Christiania. He liked what he saw and proposed to the exhibition committee of the Verein that they should invite Munch to show all of his paintings in Berlin. It is inconceivable why he came up with this suggestion, and even more incomprehensible that the committee unanimously adopted the proposal. 2 key words here are probably nationalism and Germanism. Germany was still divided in many regions, and the shaping of a national identity was an important issue. The French defeat in the Franco-Prussian War in 1870-71 and the establishment of the German Empire had strengthened their wish to develop a modern German art superior to the French. And this caused a profound skepticism against Impressionism and Post-Impressionism, which of course were regarded as French. Scandinavia, and Norway in particular, was immensely popular among many Germans who looked to the north for the roots of their race. Wilhelm II was infatuated with the Nordland and spent the summer in Norway for many years. He even visited Adolfsen Normann, who painted the emperor's ship, Hohenzollern, which we can see here, in the fjord just outside of his home. Normann was proud of his country and might have thought it a good idea to introduce a young and unknown countryman to the art scene in Berlin. As we all know, the exhibition turned out to be a great scandal, but it made Munch famous in Germany. On Munch's part, this can hardly be viewed as anything but luck, but he was quick to take advantage of the situation. Progressive art dealers offered to show his paintings in other German cities, and before Christmas, his paintings had been shown in Düsseldorf and Cologne. Munch then brought them back to Berlin and showed them at the Equitabelpalast. He had been rather annoyed because the art dealer was getting most of the profit from the show, and now he wanted to take care of everything by himself, which he did very professionally. He had a new catalog printed and all the photos of the exhibition room and many of the paintings. In 1893, the same exhibition was shown in Copenhagen, Breslau, Dresden, and Munich. Even though this exhibition was well attended everywhere, he hardly sold anything, and in the negotiations with the art dealers, he always settled for the greatest part of the entrance fee, which for many years was his main income. In a way, his exhibitions were more like performances than an opportunity to sell pictures. Scandals and bad critics made people come in large flocks to see these horrible pictures for themselves and pay the entrance fee. Munch was mainly living in Berlin between 1892 and 1995 and quickly became part of the Berlin Bohemia, an international group of progressive artists and writers. Here he met, among others, the Swedish playwright August Strindberg, who at the time even was a painter, the Polish writer Stanislaw Przybyszewski, and the young German art critic Julius Mayer-Gräfe. In 1894, Przybyszewski published a little book about Munch's art with essays by himself, Mayer-Gräfe, and two other German art writers. They were all young. 3 of them were even 4 to 5 years younger than Munch. They admired him and regarded his art as new and modern. For both Przybyszewski and Mayer-Gräfe, this was their first work of art criticism, and by linking their names to this controversial artist, they also served their own interests. In 1895, Strindberg and Mayer-Gräfe had left Berlin for Paris, and in the beginning of February 1996, Munch also arrived in Paris with great hopes of making a breakthrough. His last exhibition in Christiania had been favorably reviewed in the French magazine La Revue Blanche, followed in the next issue by a reproduction of his lithographic version of The Scream. Mayer-Gräfe, who now collaborated with Bing at his Gallery of Modern Art, had promised to help him with an exhibition there. Soon after his arrival in Paris, he made the 2-color lithograph of Angst for a print portfolio published by the art dealer LArs. He exhibited at Bing's and at the Salon des Indépendants. He was asked to draw illustrations for a special edition of Baudelaine's Les Flowers of Evil, and in the autumn he made a poster program for the performance of Henrik Ibsen's Peer Gynt at the Théâtre de l'Œuvre. In other words, success seemed to be within reach. But in 1897, he returned to Norway, having made no breakthrough, no money, but with a lot of fabulous prints. No. Oh, well, sorry. I should have put in a lot of prints there, but that was in an earlier version, I suppose. There are many theories about why Munch never succeeded in Paris. The difference in the psychology of Germans and French has been offered as an explanation, that the violent colors and strong expression in Munch's paintings appeal more to the Germans and Scandinavians than the more sophisticated French. I think that the organization of the art world may be another reason. The art scene in France was to a great deal centralized, concentrated around the large exhibitions and influential art dealers in Paris. In Germany, on the other hand, many of the regions had their own distinctive art academies and museums. In addition, Germany also had a number of Kunstvereine, art societies, that were spread all over the country. They often cooperated with art dealers or circulated exhibitions within their own network. This system probably suited Munch's way of using exhibitions for something else than just sell pictures. In 1901, Munch once more decided to try his luck in Berlin. And in the course of 1902, he made some very important new friends in Germany. He probably knew the mysterious businessman and art lover Albert Kollmann since his earlier days in Berlin, but now he took a deep interest in Munch and became one of the most determined supporters of his art. He brought a large selection of Munch's prints to the art collector Dr. Max Linde, who bought them all. Gustav Schiefler, a lawyer with a special interest in modern prints, saw them at Linde's house in Lübeck, was deeply touched by what he saw, and decided to make a complete catalogue of Munch's graphic work. These three men, Kollmann, Linde, and Schiefler, now became Munch's most important supporters in Germany. They worried about his health and helped him in many ways. Kollmann provided assignments for portraits and valuable contacts. Linde and Schiefler wrote books and articles about him and gave him advice when he entered into long-time contract with Bruno Cassirer for the sale of prints and commented for arranging exhibition and sales of paintings. The years between 1902 and 1908 were very busy. Munch remained in Germany, among other things, painting portraits of influential people. Oh, that's another one that I have skipped. Yeah, okay. At the same time, he was drinking heavily and his nerves were in a rather poor state. As we know, he had a serious breakdown in 1908, spent several months in a clinic in Copenhagen before he returned to Norway. These were also the years when the German artists known as expressionists appeared on the art scene. As mentioned, skipped. In 1912, Munch was invited to show a large selection of his work in an international exhibition in Cologne, the so-called Sonderbund exhibition. The growing nationalism in Germany and the wish to establish a genuine modern German art in opposing to the French art creates an interesting backdrop for this exhibition. Expressionism was introduced as synonymous to modern art, and the catalogue forward stresses its international character as a movement joined by young artists in almost every European country. Almost every country. Today it seems rather strange that Norway was the only Scandinavian Nordic country to be represented with a room of its own, with some artists at all. I mean, that Munch was part of this show wasn't such a surprise, but that no Danes or Swedes or Finns were even invited to show their works is a bit strange, I think. The table of contest and the map of the exhibition show that the first 5 rooms were all dedicated to Van Gogh, who was without doubt the big star in this show. If you follow this red line, you can see after Van Gogh followed Cézanne, Gauguin, Picasso, Cross and Signac in a shared room. The visitors then passed through a series of rooms where the different nations were presented. Norway was in room 14, next to Austria. Then came 3 rooms with modern German artists before entering room 20 with Munch's paintings. After Munch followed 3 more rooms with German artists. Munch was not included in the historic section with Cézanne, Gauguin, and Van Gogh, nor was he shown with his countrymen. As a famous contemporary artist, he had his own large room, situated between rooms with German artists. And Van Gogh was described in the catalogue forward as belonging to our, that is, the Germanist race. What does this mean? Was this a way to make these 2 great modern artists German? In the years following the Sonderbund exhibition, the term expressionism was more and more used to designate a particularly German art. In Norway during the First World War, Munch wanted to distance himself from the close ties to Germany and strengthened his Norwegian background. After the war, however, modern art flowered in the Weimar Republic, and Munch's popularity was as great as ever. In 1921, the Konstsalon Kassierer, where Munch had exhibited frequently after 1903, showed the first comprehensive exhibition of Munch in Germany for many years. 1 year later, followed a large exhibition in Zurich in Switzerland. Contrary to the earlier exhibitions, this was in many ways a museum show curated by the director. So was a show in Kunsthalle Mannheim in 1926. This trend reached its peak with the great retrospective in Berlin, 1927, in the Kronprinzen Palais that had been turned into the National Gallery's Department for Modern Art. Ludwig Justi was responsible for the show with good help from Munch's old acquaintance Kurt Glaser, who was then the head of the library at the National Gallery. Ludwig Justi, who had been the director of the National Gallery since 1909, was an ardent supporter of modern art and regarded Expressionism as a typical German art movement. This was the final triumph for Munch in Germany. But 6 years later, things changed dramatically. When Hitler seized power in 1933, Glaser had to leave his position because of his Jewish ancestry and Justi because of his interest in modern art. Later in the 1930s, Munch's paintings were removed from the German museums and sold abroad, just as the works by Van Gogh, Gauguin, and all the other foreign and German avant-garde artists. No, should have said that before. Munch, who died in the beginning of 1944, had bequeathed all his artworks to the city of Oslo. As soon as the war was over, the city organized large exhibitions in Scandinavia to make this extraordinary gift available to the public, and in 1950 a collection was even sent to America. By donating this great collection to the city, Munch had made it possible to make a lot of large exhibitions and also to keep his works out of the market. This, I believe, has been instrumental in securing his international recognition. So, what is the answer? Strategy or luck? Both, I suppose. As we have seen, Munch was rapidly taking advantage of the luck he had in 1892, but even so, there were strong forces beyond his control that secured his position as a modern artist. In my opinion, coincidence and luck are underestimated factors in any story of success. Of course, it takes a lot of talent and hard work, but it's also a question of timing, of being in the right place at the right time, which certainly was. Thank you.
Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. When I sent in my abstract for this conference, I had no idea that by this time I would be writing a book on Akseli Gallen-Kallela. So perhaps this talk has taken a slightly different shape than what I was planning in the beginning, and I probably should have changed the title, but because I just couldn't come up with anything smart, I just kept it as it is. But now I have decided to call this Why Not Gallen-Kallela? So that's the new title. Akseli Gallen-Kallela and Edvard Munch were almost the same age. Munch was born in 1863 and Gallen-Kallela in 1865. And their artistic careers had many parallels, and their paths even crossed a couple of times during their lifetimes, most significantly in 1895 when they exhibited together in Berlin. For a brief moment in the mid-1890s, these two artists were considered by many European or mostly German critics to be members of an ultra-modernist avant-garde. But whereas Munch is one of the few Nordic artists whose work has been included in the international canon of modernism, Gallen-Kallela is nowadays little known outside of his native country. In Finland, however, He is celebrated as a national hero, and many of his works have gained an iconic status. So the starting point of this talk is Munch's and Gallen Kallela's encounter in Berlin in 1895. But the more general aim of this case study is to shed some light on the historical, political, and ideological currents that have had their effect in placing these two artists in completely different categories. This is, of course, an extremely complicated issue, as we have already seen. There are so many factors that determine success in the art world, and these have a tendency to change over time. However, one aspect that seems relevant in this particular case is the complex relationship between art and politics. But before I delve any deeper into that issue, let's begin in Berlin, where Munch and Gallen Kallela first met. Gallen Kallela arrived in Berlin after long preparations in the very beginning of the year 1895. And by the way, he did have the necessary linguistic skills. He spoke both German and French. Already on January 4th, the Finnish press reported that Gallen Kallela was planning an exhibition in a German city, and Finnish audiences were also informed that one of the most radically modern writers in Berlin, Stanislav Przybyszewski, was going to write a critical study on Gallen Kallela. This plan never materialized, however, probably due to some tensions developing between Przybyszewski and their mutual friend, the Swedish writer Adolf Paul. You may notice that in the poster, Gallen Kallela's name appears as Axel Galén, and this was his name until around 1907, when he started to use the more Finnish version of his name. Don't be fooled into thinking that that's a typical Finnish name. It's a strange hybrid. And today's brand consultants would probably have a word or two to say about this name change. And next to the poster is the portrait that Gallen Kallela painted of Munch in 1895. And this is just a lovely quote that I have to show you. This is how Gallen Kallela remembered his Norwegian friend a couple of decades later. Munch often told me about his perceptions and experiences in a sophisticated manner, words coming from his beautiful mouth that was like an aching wound. And that made him seem scornful towards himself as well as the whole surrounding world. This sickly and agonizing smirk was always flickering around his mouth. Gallen Kallela reflected in hindsight that it had been a mistake to exhibit together because their work was so different and they had completely separate audiences. And when their paintings were viewed side by side, the comparison was not favorable for either party. The critics treated them like a pair of horses. As you can probably see from these sketches that Gallen Kallela made of Munch's paintings, he was not overly impressed by them, although he did consider Munch's graphic works outstanding, and he was just getting into graphics himself around that time. He wrote at the time of the exhibition that Munch was very talented, but way too arrogant. He was not yet a true artist because he did not make art for art's sake. That for him would have been mere child's play. Munch made art because of the terrible pain that he was suffering from. Jens Thies, the Norwegian art historian, wrote in his Munch biography that Gallen Kallela was overshadowed by Munch, which caused envy and bitterness from Gallen Kallela's part, and that eventually the two artists fell out. But Gallen Kallela himself states in his memoirs that they remained good friends. And there is some evidence that they even stayed in touch also in later life. So if there was any tension, it was only temporary. Here's a little selection of just a couple of works that were on show in the joint exhibition. Conceptio Artis, which is that work over there, was the one that probably captured most attention in the press. But he later cut it into pieces, and we don't really know why. So what about Gallen-Kallela's claim that it had been a mistake to show his work alongside Munch's? Well, Munch's work does seem more modern and expressive, I suppose, than Gallen-Kallela's at the time, particularly if it is compared with some of the slightly earlier paintings that Gallen-Kallela exhibited, such as his version of Madonna. If you compare these two Madonnas, you can see that there is clearly a difference. As Jens Thies puts it, Gallen was a good modern painter, but different enough from Munch so that there was no danger of any mix-ups. And in March, as the exhibition was coming to an end, Gallen-Kallela wrote to his friend Elin Danielsson, another Finnish artist, that his gallerist had asked to continue the exhibition for one more week, and that requests to exhibit works were coming in from every direction. And he also told his friend that he had sold a couple of paintings. So it seems that the outcome was predominantly positive. What is true, though, is that Gallen-Kallela clearly took a conscious risk when he chose Munch as his exhibition partner. The storm set off by Munch's first solo exhibition in Berlin a couple of years earlier had not yet settled. So his reputation attracted both negative and positive attention towards the exhibition. But Gallen-Kallela, who was desperate for an international breakthrough, probably thought that it was worth the gamble. He had left for Berlin after having been attacked by Finnish critics. And Adolf Paul, who had resided in the city for a while already and was familiar with its art world, had managed to convince him that he would have a more sympathetic audience in Berlin. Reception in the press was varied, but it seems that reviewers were generally quite positive towards Gallen-Kallela. And when the two artists were compared, it was often more favorable towards Gallen-Kallela. So Munch was the celebrity, the artist with a scandalous reputation, while Gallen-Kallela was praised for being technically more skilled and easier to comprehend. In the following years, Gallen-Kallela continued to exhibit his works in Germany, as well as elsewhere in Europe and around the world, actually. The Paris World Fair of 1900 was probably where his greatest international success came, with the Kalevala-themed murals at the Finnish pavilion of the 1900 exhibition. And he received a gold medal for them and plenty of international attention. In Finnish art history, this episode has gained a heightened emphasis due to its political significance, because this was the first time that Finland, which was at the time an autonomous Grand Duchy of the Russian Empire, had its own separate pavilion. And this has often been considered one of the first symbolical steps towards independence, which became a reality 17 years later, during the chaotic period following the Russian Revolution. Apart from Gallen-Kallela's role in Paris in 1900, which has been quite thoroughly examined because it reinforces his role as a national hero, art historical scholarship in Finland has typically shown little or no interest in Gallen-Kallela's international career. Now the situation has gradually started to change in recent years, and new research is on its way. But even today, the broader public has very little knowledge of this dimension of Gallen-Kallela's life and work. Not many people are aware, for instance, that when he exhibited with the Munich Secession in 1898, Kandinsky probably came to see his works because they were included in a special exhibition of Russian art at the Secession building. And of course, for Kandinsky, the kind of art that he experienced during these formative years, with emphasis on folklore and applied art, became a stepping stone towards abstraction. This was probably one of the works that were exhibited by Kallen Kallela. And it reflects the kind of archaic stylization and emphasis on folk idiom that was most enthusiastically received in Munich. During the Berlin exhibition in 1895, Kallen Kallela had been going through a kind of stylistic transformation, perhaps even a crisis. But by this time, the struggles of the previous years had been resolved, and his new Kalevala paintings represented a fully mature stylistic and ideological synthesis. The defense of the Sampo was possibly also exhibited at the Phalanx group show in 1902. At the Phalanx exhibition, Kallen Kallela showed a broad selection of works in all areas, including applied arts. One reviewer mentioned decorative wall hangings and commented favorably on their coloristic and linear abstraction. In 1904, Kallen Kallela exhibited with the Berlin and Vienna Secessions, receiving extremely positive reviews. And in 1905, he came into contact with the artists of the Brücke group, and they were particularly impressed with his woodcuts. Kallen Kallela exhibited with Die Brücke in 1906 and was invited to become a member the following year, and he took part at least in one touring exhibition in 1907, and in 1908 his Flower of Death was published in the group's portfolio. But it perhaps says something about Kallen Kallela's career developments around this time, that he continued to exhibit these works from the 1890s. In 1908, the Flower of Death already represented a bygone era, an earlier aesthetic ideal of the group. So a generation gap had developed between Kallen Kallela and the young Germans. Kallen Kallela's life and work took a completely new turn when he traveled to Africa in 1909 and stayed there for a couple of years with his family. And during this period, he developed a completely new expressionist style that may have been influenced by his German contacts. And some of these works were actually exhibited in San Francisco in 1915, before they were ever even exhibited in Finland. In fact, art historians have frequently felt uncomfortable with this imagery, because it seems to be in such stark contrast with Kallen Kallela's role as a national hero, whose works have played an important role in the development of a Finnish national identity. Generally, Kallen Kallela's position in Finnish art historiography has been exceptionally political. This is partly due to his own involvement in politics. He was a central figure in the artistic and cultural underground movement that resisted the Russian government's efforts to abolish cultural and administrative autonomy in Finland. And later he was involved in the events of the civil war that broke out almost immediately after the Finnish independence. Kallen Kallela became a close friend of the military leader Carl Gustav Mannerheim, who after the war acted as the temporary regent, and he made Kallen Kallela his personal adjutant, and Kallen Kallela designed uniforms and medals for the Finnish army. So this has something to do with his reputation as a political artist, of course. But this political dimension has dominated the way his works have been received. Of course, after Finland had gained independence, there was a great need for national heroes, particularly because of the tragic events of the Civil War. When Gallen Kallela's good friend, the art historian and politically active writer Johannes Öqvist, published a comprehensive volume on the history of Finnish art, and this was already in 1912, so before the independence, he already tackled this question of national art. Öqvist's views were greatly influenced by contemporary theories of race, and he concluded that Gallen Kallela's art was to be considered national in the sense that it reflected the archaic and Eastern qualities of the Finnish race, something he valued more highly than the European civilization of Albert Edelfelt, the other great Finnish artist of a slightly earlier generation. So whereas Edelfelt was presented as a cosmopolitan artist and a member of the German race and culture, Gallen Kallela was an original Finnish peasant, an isolated genius, free from any foreign influence. And later art historical studies solidified this persona. In Ludwig Wennervirta's Art in Finland, published in 1927, Gallen Kallela appears as the main representative of the national direction in Finnish art. A truly Finnish artist, unlike Edelfelt, with whom he is once again compared, whose art, despite its Finnish subjects, has, this direct quote, an indefinably European character. And now to jump forward a little bit, all the way to 2007, the Groningen Museum showed a broad retrospective of Gallen Kallela's works with the title The Spirit of Finland. Gallen Kallela was presented in as Finland's most renowned and important artist, whose work laid the foundation for the visual collective memory of the Finns, thus making a significant contribution to forming the Finnish national identity. And his fascination for Finland as an independent, untouched and free country is articulated in all aspects of his oeuvre. So the way that he's represented makes him essentially a Finnish artist. And if he's viewed in this way, of course he has no international relevance. Why would he be interested in an international context? So Peg Wise has written of Kandinsky that it was perhaps inevitable that historians came to view him as an almost mythical figure, above and beyond time and place. He was taken out of context, as it were. This is probably a destiny of all truly great artists, that they are taken out of context. It is also true of Munch. Gallen Kallela, on the other hand, seems to have been overdetermined by his context. Thank you.
This is the theme. Please just have a look at this. These figures from Art Facts tell us about an art world totally dominated by artists from the United States and Germany, with a single exception of the Spanish artists at the top, next to Warhol. The figures of this Art Facts is based partly on counting exhibitions, and looking at these figures concerning galleries and museums, we have no problem understanding the domination by Americans and Germans. 6,396 exhibition institutions, museums in the United States, 5,973 Germany, and then Italy, United Kingdom, Spain, Switzerland, Austria, and Japan, 901, China, 680. As you'll see to the right, the Nordic countries, they are actually not not bad off, because this is, if you count it together, it's a good figure, actually, for such a small community as the Nordic countries. But it tells the story of this totally domination of American, German, other European countries in the global art system. If you look at the figures for the sale figures and results from auctions, it confirms roughly this situation. The concepts of nationalism and globalism apparently as two terms that excludes each other. But does a global perspective constitute a radical difference from being national? Some critics of globalism speaks about globalism as a new form of nationalism, based on the idea of globalism being an extension of the idea of a nation understood as a state claiming a territory based on the postulate that the population in the given territory is a natural or a cultural given entity. By local in the title, I do not refer to nation. Global art could accordingly be understood as art, as a carrier of certain values the population of the global art world identifies as commonly held. They form an integrated part of the belief system of the global art community. I have to remark that a belief system do not require empirical evidence and can be looked upon as a guiding principle for action. The system acts accordingly to what it believes is the case. Since Munch is a great artist, I have to act in a proper manner, befitting and respecting his greatness, even if I should think he's not that great. Or else I will risk exclusion as a participant in the belief system of the global art community. I am participating in a belief group that shares basic or foundational values. Group beliefs is not individual beliefs, it's attributed to groups, and the belief in case is not necessarily shared by everyone as individuals. The claim that the values the participants in the global art world held has a universal validity has nurtured criticism of globalization in general, and thus also of the global art world on both sides of left and right side of policy. I have for the last 40 years been curating approximately 100 exhibitions, most of them comprising art by male white artists inside and outside of the established canon. From Munch to Harald Solberg, which I curated from the exhibition in New York in '94. I've also been involved with the exhibition by Picasso and totally unknown Norwegian names you wouldn't recognize. So I've been on both sides of the fence when it comes to this problematic about canon, local and global and national, international. From this experience, I will look at the discussion of global, local, from the angle of the famous and important Norwegian social philosopher, Stein Rokkan. Stein Rokkan is the most cited Norwegian political philosopher internationally. He died in 1979. And he proposed a model based on the relationship between center and periphery. And it was based on an understanding of Europe seen as a patchwork of outskirts, each with its own requirement for understanding, based on its own prerequisites and own history. And if you put this art world idea into this, you could say that the art world is a patchwork of outskirts, each with its own requirement for understanding, based on its own prerequisites and own history. This according to Bernd Hagved in Politics Between Economics and Culture. It can be argued that the axis center-periphery can be divided into the absolute center, characterized by a lack of awareness of other cultures or lack of valuation of other cultures. The semi-periphery that is at the same time subjected to a cultural center, but has the means to resist. And the absolute periphery, who lacks the means to resist. Norway is a semi-periphery. And a big part of Norwegian art historically has, writing or art history, has traditionally turned around the placement of Norwegian art and artists in relationship to the international art world. At the same time, it has always been a strong undercurrent questioning the value of this willingness to understand art as a result of external impulses from the center to the periphery, and to a higher degree appreciate the elements of an artwork that is singular and specific and tells something that is important, profound, and characteristic of the particular culture, place, and time. An interesting and challenging example of the problematic of the center-periphery is the presentation of several Sami artists at the latest edition of the Documenta. Many of the artists was quite unknown even to the Norwegian art world, except one artist. This is a young artist called Maritana Sara. She's not, was not well known before she went to Documenta. And this is heads of reindeers belonging to her brother. And this is a kind of tapestry or screen she made from all these heads. And the problematic in this was a discussion of new colonialism in the most developed democracy in the world, Norway. And here we have the artists, and also interesting photographs of bison heads, a photograph from the 1870s, which is, of course, related to the picture down the right corner. Another artist, Synnøve Persson. Well, she's not very well known in Norway. I know her because she used to stay in Trondheim when I lived there in the 1980s. And she relates, of course, to this famous painting, Who's Afraid? And she relates it to the Sami flag, as you see. So this was also in this Documenta exhibition. And Synnøve Persson, she has always been very concerned about being not a Sami artist foremost, but an artist. While the one really famous Norwegian Sami artist, Ivar Joks, to the left, he, in an interesting way, blends elements from the Sami tradition and the Sami concept of art, which is actually based on the concept of craft. So he blends this into his own mixture in a way, and it seems, and I think it's very interesting to compare this with Jimmy Durham having an exhibition at the Whitney at the moment, which I presume you have seen, all of you. And I looked at it yesterday. Very interesting. I liked it very much at the beginning, but then I got this feeling that this was more about inventing than really something new and interesting, telling me new interesting histories about American Indians. And as you know, it has come up this discussion about Jimmy Durham being an Indian activist. Iver Joks, he was an activist, a Sami activist, but first and foremost a Norwegian and Sami artist. And he's the only artist included in the books by Danbolt and also by Ustvedt. And those two books are, in a way, a kind of standard reference when it comes to reading about Norwegian contemporary art. And they include Iver Joks. We can discuss how it was included, but I will not do that at the moment. In my opinion, the Sami artists challenge and give an opportunity to discuss prevailing discourses of art regarding issues of identity, politics, ethics, and art, and not least the concept of art. What is it, and what could it be, and how does it work? Should it work? We should also emphasize a discussion concerning, should we leave this work outside of the established canon? Should we keep its position at the margins of the presumed national or international or global art world? Does it work better at the margins of that? As we know, some artists are very concerned about not being part of any belief group. And many artists represent a systematic negative dialectic approach to art, inspired, among others, by Adorno, and in order to protect their integrity and to keep the critical potential of their work. As we heard with Asger Jorn, actually, a very interesting example of just this happening with an artist. Because I read his reaction as, I don't want to be part of that believing group. And I want to keep on the outside of that system and not be included. And of course, as a very radical artist, it fits him. During the 1980s, we witnessed a series of exhibitions on themes concerning the Nordic light and Scandinavian art, attempts to incorporate Nordic art into the international exhibition circuit, and works its way into the, at that time, international art system. Today, it would be the global art system and the global art market. Several Scandinavian artists have for the past 30 years been included in international exhibitions, but usually it's a single work, probably sometimes a group of works, that fits into a thematical exhibition. But lately, we have observed a new trend that could pose challenges to the dialectics between art scholarship, institutions, private and public, money and market. But before I enter into that, just mentioning this painting by Harald Solberg, Fisherman's Cottage. It belongs to the Art Institute of Chicago. And it was included in the museum in Chicago after the exhibition in New York. And the idea was actually to sell it, to get money to buy, not Solberg, but other artists, but it was kept in the collection, and it still is in the collection. But it's the only painting by Solberg that is in a collection outside of Norway. When this painting was exhibited in New York in 94, 95, the critic Roberta Smith wrote about it and the exhibition, and it was a kind of combination between Munch and Solberg, but two separate exhibitions. Solberg on one floor, Munch on another floor. So it was not a comparison between the two artists. But the book I wrote at that time, called Landscapes of the Mind, the idea was to compare them related to the concept of symbolism. They represented two different approaches to symbolism. That was the idea. And Roberta Smith, she wrote about this painting. She was very positive about the exhibition. But it was one small thing she would have wanted the artist to do. And that was to elaborate more on this abstract pattern of the trees and why put this landscape in the background. It would have been much more interesting, much more radical, of course, if it just was the pattern of the trees. I suppose she had in mind Mondrian, but Solberg is not Mondrian. And this kind of abstraction was very far from what he ever considered his artistical goals. So if you are going to understand an artist like Solberg, you have to put him into these more local contexts. But back to the dialectics between art scholarship, institutions, private and public, money and market. My first encounter as a curator with this issue was a collection of paintings by Nikolai Astrup, owned by a Norwegian ship owner, Brynildsen. That was exhibited at the Henrions Art Center while I was a head curator at the institution in the 1990s. The collection was used later as a collateral to a loan, and it became the property of the DNB Savings Bank, and now it is the property of the DNB Savings Bank Foundation, on loan to the Code in Bergen. Following the deposit of this collection at Code, it has been established a research department financed by DNB Savings Foundation. It has also been several exhibitions of Astrup in Norway, England, Germany, Denmark. I'm probably missing out something, and it's soon, I presume, coming to a place near you. The effects of all this remains to be seen. One effect that we already register is that Astrup's position in the Norwegian market and canon has increased significantly, changing his position from an interesting but rather local figure on the west coast of Norwegian art, moving him into the center of the national Norwegian canon. I would presume that we should presume that his representation in the new National Museum of Art will increase, or that his work will always be on display. That has not always been the case, actually. The only problem is, of course, that institution doesn't own the best paintings. You have to go to Bergen. And preferably, it should rain the day you look at Astrup. I mean that. The financial resources associated with the promotion of Astrup could blur the traditionally dividing line between different types of institutions, public and private. This can be seen as an expression of a globalization ideology associated with neoliberalism, and is quite contrary to the values that we associate with the so-called Scandinavian model. A model experiencing strong pressure at the time being. To keep its autonomy, the institutions on both sides have to find ways to deal with conflicts of interest. The Scandinavian model emphasizes on reaching for consensus through negotiation. And that will be of importance to secure the autonomy. As you should remember, the November Revolution never came to the Scandinavian countries. and it was in one way not an option. Probably that could be the reason, this culture of negotiating between opposite positions could be one reason, at least, for the lack of historically avant-garde in the Norwegian art. Most Norwegian artists negotiate opposite positions instead of being a partisan. As a result of this, Norwegian art, new and old, is probably not easy to streamline into the mainstream of art, well suited to be included in the global market. Do I have 1 minute? No? What? That was the minute, yeah. But that was also the end.
Okay, here we go. The figure of the artist genius is familiar to us all as the very hallmark of artistic excellence and branding within art and culture. The notion of genius pertains to the most prominent of artists. Much has been written on the concept of genius within the context of Romanticism and Modernism. Aesthetic and art theoretical discourses have played an important role in the shaping of the myth of the artist's genius. However, the stories of individual artists have even more so contributed to disseminating and cementing the myth of the genius, being it in the form of the artist's biography or the art historical monograph. Literary tropes and topoi of genius had at play in these literary genres have been of significance to the promotion of numerous artists, and thereby not only contributing to the individual legend of artists, but also enforcing the more generic myth of the artist's genius as such. In their seminal work from 1934, Legend, Myth, and Magic in the Image of the Artist, Ernst Chris and Otto Kurtz claim that the artist's biography plays a key role in conveying and developing certain stereotypical notions of the artist. To no surprise, this is also the case of Edvard Munch. He was early in his career, to a large extent due to his self-fashioning as an artist, written into the discourse of genius by authors as Stanislav Piłsudski and Julius Mayer-Gräfe, further enhanced by a number of later writers. In the following, I will give a brief presentation of a reading of a particular trope of genius exemplifying this claim. The talk is based on, on some passages from a chapter in development for my upcoming PhD thesis dealing with the literary image of Munch as artist genius in Rolf Stenersen's 1944 biography, Edvard Munch, Close-Up of a Genius. Rolf Stenersen was a Norwegian author, financier, art collector, and friend of Munch, born in 1899 and died in 1978. His biography on Munch was first published in 1944 in Sweden, translated from his Norwegian manuscript. The book was first published in its original language in 1945, and a second revised and extended Norwegian edition was furthermore published in 1946. The first English translation appeared in 1969. Stenersen's biography is far from a scholarly work, drawing heavily on anecdotes, quoting unverifiable and even semi-fictional dialogues, carelessly blurring distinction of fact and fiction, swapping notoriously between first and third person narrative, bringing the author into the story, and depicting the character of Munch through hagiographic and mythologizing descriptions. The book is only one of numerous biographies and monographs published on Munch in the mid-19th century, by works by authors as Jens Thies, Paula Gauguin, and J.P. Houdin, just to name a few, none of these being of other than historical significance today, Stenersen's book, however, still stands the test of time with its latest edition released in 2012. So, what does a genius look like? Without speculating in the intentions of Stenersen, I suppose that would be one of the first questions one would ask oneself if one were to portray the artist as genius, as the title of the biography suggests. With reference to French literary theorist Gérard Genet's theory of paratext, I will in the following claim that the cover image of the dust jacket of the first edition of Stenersen's book, the Swedish as well as the Norwegian, as you can see here, might be a fruitful place to start in answering the question. According to Jeanette, the paratext is, and I quote, the productions that surround the text of a literary work and extend it precisely in order to present it to the public as an influence that is at the service of a better reception of the text and a more pertinent reading of it, end of quote. The cover piece consists of a close-up photograph of Edvard Munch in full profile, accompanying the title of the book and the name of the author. The photographer Anders Behr Wilse shot the photo in 1933 on the occasion of Munch's 70-year anniversary. However, the image on the dust jacket is a radically cropped version of the original photographic print, underlining the title of the biography through the effect of a close-up. Comparing the two versions, you will note the spatial delimiting effect of the cropping to the space surrounding the artist. The original print is much in line with the conventions of professional studio photography, with the right amount of space surrounding the head of the sitter, leaving little room for imagination as to the setting of the image. The cropped version on the dust jacket, however, reduces space to such an amount that the image is no longer in line with the conventions of portrait photography, and furthermore creates an effect of spatial abstraction, leaving the reader questioning the situation of the photograph. The radical cropping creates an effect of an imaginary space outside of the image. This effect is underlined by the highlight hitting Munch's face from the angle of which he is looking slightly sideways into a space unknown to the reader. The image, I will claim, might very well be read metaphorically in terms of a notion of the artist's extraordinary perceptual abilities, as if he were looking into an enlightened world not yet known to the reader. So how does this read in comparison to the textual portrayal of Munch in the biography? Not surprisingly, tropes of Munch's unique ability to see or even to sense in more general terms run through the narrative, enforcing the notion of a visionary artist having access to the nature of the world as hidden to others. However, keeping it to the opening sequence of the book, this notion is enhanced through the description of Munch's physical appearance in the first few paragraphs of the book. And I will quote this at length. Handsome men sometimes appear effeminate and weak. Edvard Munch was handsome, frail, and of a delicate nature. Nevertheless, his appearance revealed no weakness. He had an unusual, sturdy, and beautiful head. People would turn around to have a look at him long before he became a famous artist. People seeing Munch would never forget. His hair was blonde and wavy, his forehead arched and high, his eyes bluish-gray. His nose and mouth were attractively shaped, despite a somewhat narrow lower lip. And he always carried his head high. His sturdy chin gave an illusion of great strength. He was slender, a little taller than average, erect, but not athletic. His total appearance, however, his straight back, his chiseled features gave an impression of ancient nobility, end of quote. This idiosyncratic and somewhat esoteric description of Munch might at first give off an impression slightly in contrast to the image of the dust jacket. However, opening the book, one will find another portrait of Munch as the frontispiece. This time around, a well-known self-portrait by Munch from 1886, reproduced in black and white. Here the artist is facing the reader in three-quarter profile. The facial features of the self-portrait seems more in line with Stenersen's textual description of Munch, at least complementing the photographic portrait with regards to the text. This is even more obvious in another self-portrait by Munch of contextual significance to this paratextual comparison. In the art collection of Stenersen, there is a sketch that Munch made for the very same self-portrait hanging in the author's library until the early 1940s. There you can see it in the library on the right-hand side there. The appearance of Munch in this drawing is overtly effeminate and refined, giving off a glorious impression with his head appearing as with a halo of hair, as if materializing out of empty space, suggesting a unique, elevated, and even timeless property. As Jon Ove Steihaug has pointed out, with reference to Josef Leo Körner's work on Albert Dürer, Munch's self-portraits might be regarded in the tradition of artistic self-staging from the Renaissance onwards. The figure of the genius is, of course, at core here, even though the concept of it changes throughout this long historical period. With regards to this particular self-portrait of Munch, Dürer's self-portrait from 1498 might be an obvious reference, where the artist presents himself in three-quarter profile and with the very same slanted gaze. However, with regards to the spatial qualities of Munch's work, it would be even more relevant to compare it to Dürer's self-portrait of 1500, which again reminds us of Munch's self-portrait with skeleton arm from 1895, reproduced on the page following the frontispiece of the first Swedish edition. Körner has commented on the Christ-like appearance of the latter self-portrait by Dürer and claims that the artist in this particular picture goes further than the doctrine of imitato Christi. With the self-portrait of 1500, Dürer, according to Körner, legitimizes a new and modern tradition of artistic self-portraiture. I am quoting Körner. By transferring the attributes of the imagistic authority and quasi-magical power associated with the true and the sacred image of God to the novel subject of self-portraiture, Dürer legitimizes his radically new notion of art, one based on the irreducible relation between self and the work of art, end of quote. In other words, the artist, through his work, plays the role of the creator with a divine and unique insight into the true workings of the world. Another canonical artist of relevance would be Rembrandt, an artist mentioned several times by Stenersen as one of Munch's very few idols. His self-portrait of 1628, of course, being an apparent work of reference. The tenebroso hair, the sensitive and effeminate appearance of the face, the three-quarter profile, and the empty mist-like space surrounding the artist are features strikingly similar to the 1886 drawing by Munch. In The Dark Side of Genius, Lorinda S. Dixon has noted how Rembrandt's self-portrait plays on the iconography of the melancholic. With Rembrandt, the self-staging of the artist takes yet another turn, according to Dixon. quote, by presenting of themselves as themselves as melancholic, Dixon writes, artists were not necessarily exposing their inner souls or confessing grief-stricken lives. More often, they were fulfilling popular expectation of how artists look, and most important, how their work defined and enhanced their social roles and professional capacities. That is to say, with the artistic ideal of the melancholic, the artist not only plays the role of the creator, but also that of the apostle of the inner life of humankind. This brings me back to Stenersen's text, and yet another canonical artist genius of significance to the author's image of Munch. With reference to Paula Gauguin's 1933 biography on Munch, Stenersen claims that there is a striking physiological similarity between Munch and Leonardo da Vinci. The proof is, so to speak, is found in Gauguin's book and a juxtaposition of a self-portrait by Leonardo in full profile and a photographic portrait of Munch shot by Anders Behr Wilse in 1933. Stenersen then goes on to explain this physiological kinship of Leonardo and Munch in terms of a phrenological and psychoanalytical kinship of Stenersen then goes on to explain this physiological kinship of Leonardo and Munch in terms of a phrenological and psychoanalytic approach, boiling it down to common personality traits. According to Stenersen, they were both characterized by their strong will, but also by their split mind and an alienated nature. In other words, as with Dixon's reading of Rembrandt, Stenersen is proposing or staging a correlation between the physiological appearance of the artist and his unique ability to experience and express the inner life of man. It is as if Leonardo, by way of a proposed physiological likeness with Munch, plays the role of a visionary soul-searching forefather for the latter, through which a lineage of genius is established. This becomes even clearer in a concluding remark Stenersen makes regarding Munch's physical appearance towards the end of the same paragraph. He comments upon the impression Munch made on people upon seeing him. According to Stenersen, the impression was not due to Munch's beauty, but rather his eccentric appearance, and I quote, his dreamy and effeminate gaze. Considering Stenersen's interest and knowledge of surrealism and symbolism, the gendered allusion to the world of dreams through the gaze of the artist might very well be read in the context of the notion of the artist's exceptional ability to enter the unconscious and make the unknown visible. The point I'm making is that the image being conveyed of Munch in the opening sequence of Stenersen's book is that of the artist as a visionary prophet. The concept of the artist as a visionary or a seer was central to much 19th and 20th century aesthetics and art theory, and stands strong within the romantic and modernist myth of the artist's genius. The notion of the visionary artist is closely linked to ideas of originality and creativity. As Mush Barash has pointed out, the distinctive characteristic of the artist of the 19th century was his, quote, ability to penetrate the surface of life, to discover the primary forms, and to present them to the creator's, to the spectator's eyes, end of quote. With reference to Charles Baudelaire's declaration of the defined faculty of the imagination of the artist and his ability to observe the secret order of the world, Michel Foucault's claims that the figure of the artist as a quasi divine creator became central to the symbolist image of the artist. As Falck notes, the image of the artist as Christ was common among symbolist artists and empowered the notion of the creative artist, drawing on his imagination to envision new worlds, or as Falck puts it, quote, symbolists accorded privileged genius status to individuals able to penetrate appearances in order to reveal underlying eternal truths, the recognition of which was essential to humanity's salvation. To conclude, through the textual and paratextual representation of Munch in the opening sequence of Stenersen's book, an image of Munch as a visionary and a prophetic artist genius is conveyed, much in line with the avant-garde notion of the artist's faculty to unveil the true nature of the world and thus lead humanity into a better future, or as Donald Cuspid has pointed out in The Cult of the Avant-Garde Artist, the artist does not only have to have the perceptual abilities of the visionary, but also takes on the role of being the, quote, existential conscious of humankind. And this is, for the end, a piece by Bruce Nauman from 1969. I believe it's captured the whole concept very well. Thank you.
Thank you, first of all, for all the wonderful contributions. Are there any questions in the audience? Before we... Questions? There are questions.
Yeah, how seriously do academics take the Stenson biography of Munch? I mean, is it considered a valuable resource for real academic study, or is it more stories and hearsay?
I take it seriously, but I really believe Gerd Woll is as the Munch scholar, is the proper person to answer that question.
No, I think it's quite okay that you do it. You have been working more on this particular problem than I have.
Well, what I was trying to say is I wouldn't, as a Munch scholar, at the outset, I wouldn't take it, I wouldn't say seriously, but I wouldn't trust it. It's a highly literary biography, verging on being a novel. So.
Is it? Oh, yeah. I'm just wondering if I could invite. This is something that came up at the end of Caitlin's talk and in Robert Jensen's talk as well. And I'm wondering if I could invite you to talk about, when we talk about marketing, we're also talking about marketing desire. And I thought, Lars, maybe if you'd had more time, you would have gone further into that, because it seems to me that Stenersen is creating this incredibly desirable image of the artist. This is something I've been thinking about in relation to the self-portraits as well, and it came up in that wonderful quote from Gal and Kalela, of course, about Munch's mouth. There's a whole book to be written on Munch's mouth, I think. And I'm just wondering, I could invite anybody really to talk about the way in which marketing is about marketing desire and how that affects texts and images.
I found that quote very intriguing as well, and the issue of desire, runs through Stenersen's depiction of Munch in creating this certain literary or mythological image of the artist, which is, of course, in one sense, very much about branding. Especially considering Stenersen's personal and financial investments in Edvard Munch.
Yeah, I might add to that you know, as I mentioned in my talk, that there was this huge need for national heroes in the newly independent Finland, and I think desire is an element also in that you know, they had to present Kallen Kallela in a certain light because there was this need, there was a desire.
Well, I was just wondering now, I mean, if we are talking about branding and national desire, the general role of the collector, and Gerd Woll, you were talking also about Schiefler and Linde and Meyer Graefe. I mean, they were also important for Munch's career, early career, and they were all collectors themselves. And I mean, was there this kind of, or Stenersen, and I mean, this interest in their own collection and to market the artist?
Yeah, of course, the collectors played a very, very important part in this. And when Linde first bought a painting by Munch and included that in his collection of modern work, that was also a very important kind of including Munch as one of the really important modern artists. And Munch himself knew this very well. So he also wanted to have his works in good collections. Ernest Thiel, for instance, in Stockholm, Munch advised him to go and visit Linde to see how he had built up his private gallery and see his collection. And this is a very, very important part of it, I think. So thank you, Ute, for bringing that up.
There's a question in the back.
Hi. My name is Kessia. I work at Kode in Bergen. And thank you, everybody, for such an interesting session. My question goes to Lars. I think it was very interesting hearing about Stenersen's reception and understanding of Edvard Munch's his appearance and the way he looked. And I'm thinking of the long tradition of depicting the genius, going back to Aristotle, of course. And I've been studying a bit I haven't prepared this, it just came to me. The appearance, for example, of another Norwegian artist, Gustav Vigeland, who where the biographical literature depicts him as a genius, but ugly of appearance. And in the tradition of the genius, often the darkness of the face and the melancholic appearance is maybe a more traditional depiction of the genius. So I would just like to hear your opinion of Stenersen's description of the beautiful genius.
Well, that's an the same. I haven't really started working on that yet, but my plan is so this is I'm improvising here. But the same passage as I was reading will also be the outset for a reading of Stenersen's gendering, and I would also even say queering of the artist, of the masculine artist on the one side, and the beautiful, effeminate artist or on the other side, and that of course plays into the whole discourse of gender and genius in late 19th century art theoretical discourse or aesthetic discourse. So, but I don't know if that really answered your question. Stenersen was not very fond of Vigeland, that I can say, at least in his book on Munch, and he very much uses, in my opinion, if you read the compare the two characters in the book. He always uses or tend to use Vigeland as a kind of an anti-hero, emphasizing certain aspects of Munch. Of course, the infamous fight in Berlin being a very good case, but that brings me into another whole other discussion, so I will quit there.
I'm afraid we have to have a break now, otherwise we are running too late, but we can very well continue outside with a coffee, and then we meet again in 15 minutes. Is that sufficient? Yeah? Thank you.